Italy, the land of Mussolini. Under the banner of fascism, the country was not only a strategic partner of Hitler, but also an executioner in its colonies and occupied territories. Italian troops used banned chemical weapons in Africa, wiped out entire populations in the Balkans, and ran a network of camps where hunger and disease became tools of extermination. With such a record, one might expect that, at the end of World War II, Italy would face a trial comparable to Nuremberg or Tokyo. But that never happened. Why? Was it because Italy switched sides in 1943? A geopolitical calculation by the United States and the United Kingdom, or the looming Cold War? The questions are many, and in this video, we will search for the answers. This is the story of the missing trial. Italian war crimes formed a web of systematic violence that stretched from Africa to the Balkans. Three examples help illustrate the brutality of fascism in action.
In the autumn of 1935, over 500,000 Italian troops invade Ethiopia in a savage act of revenge.
The campaign in Ethiopia became a laboratory of colonial terror. There, Rodolfo Graziani led operations that included the use of mustard gas, bombings of Red Cross hospitals, and ruthless repression against any sign of resistance. The most brutal episode occurred on February 19, 1937. An assassination attempt against Graziani in Addis Ababa triggered the Yekatite 12 massacre. In just 3 days, nearly 30,000 civilians were killed. Their bodies were dumped into mass graves or burned. Weeks later, Italian troops carried out the Debre Libanos massacre. Up to 1,000 monks and pilgrims were executed inside a monastery. These were not isolated excesses. They were exemplary punishments designed to break Ethiopian morale and carried out under plans personally endorsed by the Dutse.
Mussolini wanted to create a kind of copy of South Africa in Ethiopia. In other words, to turn the Ethiopian population into what amounted to slaves or serfs and create a massive immigrant population of Italians who would practice a kind of apartheid.
But this was not the end. Years later, when Italy occupied Croatia and Slovenia, General Mario Roata implemented a policy he called terror as discipline, his order number. 3C made the method clear: villages burned to the ground, hostages executed, torture and starvation used deliberately. In those two countries alone, the death toll exceeded 13,000. In May 1942, Roata ordered the creation of the Rab concentration camp on the Croatian coast. By October, it held 8,260 prisoners, most of them Slovens. They were crammed into tents and unfinished barracks, given just 80 grams of bread per day, and soup cooked in fuel drums.
Mussolini orders a brutal policy of pacification.
He
orders his generals to exterminate any opposition, to lock them in concentration camps.
Campo di concentramento.
Italian repression was also institutionalized through a vast system. Recent research has documented 135 concentration camps, 85 forced labor camps, and 651 prisons, along with facilities for prisoners of war. In Somalia, the Danani camp, created in 1935, held thousands of Ethiopian prisoners, including women and children. Malnutrition was routine. Rice infested with worms, contaminated water, rock-hard biscuits. The sick were left in tents to die within days. A camp doctor was even accused of administering lethal injections. Of the 6,500 inmates held there, nearly half died. This structure of violence shows that Italy was not a minor or irrelevant actor within the Axis. It was a regime that made terror and extermination part of its occupation policy, even before its full alliance with Hitler. So where was the difference?
The extent of Italian atrocities was not lost on the Allied powers, who considered fascist criminals to be on par with their German and Japanese colleagues. As such, as early as January 1942, the representatives of 18 Allied governments held an inter-Allied conference on the punishment of war crimes, during which they signed a declaration pledging to investigate, prosecute, and judge, to quote, those guilty or responsible for the commission of acts of violence inflicted upon the civilian populations, whatever the nationality. And of course, this would include Italians.
If there was one event that radically changed Italy's position in the war, it was the armistice of September 8, 1943. After the fall of Mussolini, Marshal Pietro Badoglio signed an agreement with the Allies. Italy, once an enemy, became a co-belligerent against Germany. From that moment on, the country was no longer seen only as guilty, but as a useful partner for opening a second front in Europe.
Following the September 8th armistice, Badoglio and US General Eisenhower signed a second agreement on September the 29th, the Instrument of Surrender. According to its Article 29, the new Italian government was obliged to arrest and surrender into the hands of the United Nations, to quote, Benito Mussolini, his chief fascist associates, and all persons suspected of having committed war crimes or analogous offences whose names appear on lists to be communicated by the United Nations and who now or in the future are on territory controlled by the Allied military command or by the Italian government.
At the same time, the Allies began designing a judicial framework for war crimes. In the Moscow Declaration, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union agreed that Axis criminals should be tried in the countries where their crimes were committed. This included Italians. That same year, the United Nations War Crimes Commission was created. It gathered evidence and compiled lists of suspects. By 1948, the Commission had identified more than 1,200 Italians as responsible for war crimes, including high-ranking military officers and colonial officials. The 1947 peace treaty with Italy reinforced this obligation. The country was required to arrest and surrender criminals requested by the victorious powers. Ethiopia demanded the extradition of Graziani and other generals responsible for massacres. Yugoslavia did the same with Rwanda and other commanders in the Balkans.
According to the plan, the United Nations would draft a list of 50 to 100 Italian fascist criminals who could then be executed on the spot without incurring any punishment on the individuals who killed them. It was a nationally sponsored hit list, essentially. No jurisprudence needed. This would be much simpler than involving the courts or allowing for, basic human rights.
In practice, reality diverged sharply from what was written on paper. The Allies, especially the United States and the United Kingdom, prioritized political stability in Italy as communist influence grew across Europe. The logic was simple. Integrating Italy into the Western Bloc was more useful than reopening judicial wounds that could further fracture a country emerging from civil war. Justice was therefore subordinated to Cold War strategy. Italian criminals were identified, but they never faced an international stage comparable to Nuremberg or Tokyo. Between 1945 and 1946, there was a real plan to create an Italian Nuremberg. The goal was not to judge Italy as a defeated nation, but to put on trial those responsible for reprisals in the Balkans, in Ethiopia, and within Italy during the German occupation. Allied prosecutors collected testimonies, documents, military orders, and lists of suspects. The evidence was abundant. In theory, nothing prevented the launch of a collective trial against fascist crimes. Yet the plan never materialized. The closest thing to justice came instead from acts of resistance as the war came to an end in April 1945.
By the 25th of the month, World War II officially ended in Italy, initiating a short yet intense period of trials, executions, and retribution against fascists no longer in power. Benito Mussolini himself and 17 of his top officials were executed by resistance factions on April 28th. More fascist party officials, police commissioners, military leaders, and even regular foot soldiers would be tried and sentenced to death by improvised courts, also set up by the resistance.
The project collapsed under three major obstacles. The first was Italy's internal political transition. In 1946, a referendum abolished the monarchy and gave birth to the Italian Republic. The country was deeply polarized. Christian Democrats and Communists battled for power, and a massive trial against hundreds of military officers risked igniting even greater tensions. The second obstacle was the division among the victorious powers. The Soviet Union pushed for exemplary trials that would harshly punish fascist crimes and preserve their memory. The United States and the United Kingdom wanted to close the chapter quickly and consolidate Italy as a Western stronghold in the Mediterranean. Ideological rivalry translated into judicial paralysis. The third factor was the territorial and judicial dispute with Yugoslavia. Marshal Tito demanded the extradition of Italian officers for massacres in Dalmatia and Slovenia. Italy, quietly supported by London and Washington, resisted. Rome feared that extraditions would strengthen Yugoslavia's position in negotiations over Trieste and the eastern border. As each side defended its interests, time passed. The commission tasked with pursuing war criminals delivered no meaningful results.
The Commission was never interested in bringing criminals to justice, shocking we know, but only as a tool to buy time while the government reinforced its ties with the Western Allies. At the same time, the Commission would gather evidence about anti-Italian atrocities at the Foibe, which could be used as a case to prevent extraditions to Yugoslavia. And this all worked. From 1946 to 1947, Rome resisted any request from Belgrade to extradite, let alone bring to trial former fascists active in Yugoslavia.
In the end, the outcome was abandonment. Instead of a grand tribunal, there were scattered trials, British proceedings against war criminals in Italy, investigations in Ethiopia that led nowhere, case files that never reached a courtroom. The most symbolic episode came in 1994 with the discovery in Rome of a hidden archive known as the Cabinet of Shame. Hundreds of documents detailing Italian war crimes had been deliberately shelved for decades. It was proof of a trial that was never meant to happen. Had the post-war period followed the treaties to the letter, Italy should have handed over dozens of fascist generals and officials. But reality was different. From 1944 onward, provisional governments in Rome adopted a strategy of delay, negotiating directly with Washington and London. The goal was clear: avoid extraditions and protect figures from the military and political apparatus who were still seen as necessary for stability. Western powers made this possible. The United States and the United Kingdom discouraged Yugoslavia and Ethiopia from pressing extradition demands, even against figures like Marshal Badoglio, the armistice signatory considered useful for the transition. The calculation was pragmatic. Preserving Italian cooperation mattered more than empowering Tito. In 1946 came the decisive blow, the Togliatti Amnesty.
On June the 22nd, Minister of Justice Palmiro Togliatti, who was also Communist Party secretary, issued a general amnesty offered to all those responsible for political and war crimes. There were exceptions, of course. The amnesty would not apply to cases of pillage, torture, murder and massacre. High-ranking officials and military officers would also not benefit from this decree.
The amnesty aimed to pacify a country still divided by civil war between fascists and partisans. The decree pardoned political crimes committed by both sides. Under the banner of reconciliation, thousands of accused individuals were released or had their cases closed. For the Allies, the amnesty was welcome. It avoided long trials and eased Italy's integration into the Western Bloc. For survivors in Ethiopia and the Balkans, it meant the final denial of justice. No Italian general was extradited, and only a few dozen British trials on Italian soil resulted in minor convictions. The contrast was stark. While Nazi atrocities were exposed before the world at Nuremberg, fascist crimes were relegated to forgotten files and silenced memories. Italy not only avoided a major trial, but also built a national narrative in which fascism was punished in streets and squares, not in courtrooms. The absence of institutional justice did not mean the absence of punishment. With the collapse of 1945 came a wave of lynchings, summary executions, and popular revenge against fascist leaders and collaborators. It was immediate, brutal, and chaotic justice, carried out in streets and plazas. More a collective release than a legal process. The most iconic case was Benito Mussolini himself. Captured by partisans while attempting to flee to Switzerland, disguised as a German soldier, he was executed on April 28, 1945, in Giulino di Mezzegra. The next day, his body was taken to Milan, hung upside down in Piazzale Loreto, and exposed to public scorn. The image spread around the world. It became the symbol of the end of Italian fascism, not a solemn trial, but a popular execution. Mussolini was not alone. Across Italy, hundreds of local leaders, members of the Italian Social Republic, and collaborators were executed without trial. Some at the hands of partisans, others in spontaneous lynchings by communities that had endured occupation and reprisals. It was a reckoning that mixed justice with vengeance, memory with accumulated hatred. Paradoxically, this end-of-war violence was seen by many as sufficient. With the Duce and several of his symbols punished, the demand for a national trial lost momentum. For the Allies, these public executions reinforced the idea that Italy had solved its fascist problem in its own way. For the new Italian state, in the midst of democratic transition, the official narrative preferred to look forward and to silence both the atrocities committed in Ethiopia or Yugoslavia and the internal acts of revenge. In the end, Italy never had its Nuremberg because between 1943 and 1948, geopolitics, internal transition, and the Cold War outweighed the drive for accountability. There were proven crimes, lists of suspects, and archived documents. What was missing was the political and judicial will to bring them together. Instead of a grand tribunal, there were popular lynchings, reconciliation amnesties, and files hidden away in the cabinet of shame. The historical paradox is clear. Italy preserved its political system and its place in the West, but lost the chance for a judicial reckoning that could have defined responsibility and left a universal testimony against the horrors of fascism. This brings us to the end. If you enjoyed this video, we invite you to join us in our next release as we continue exploring military history.